Failed infection attempts in order to be able to better assess the puzzling mass disease. An attempt to simulate infection was undertaken with volunteers in Boston in November 1918. These were 62 healthy sailors charged with delinquency and sent to prison. They had been promised a pardon under the condition that they take part in an experiment. 39 of them had not had influenza. So the theory was that they would be particularly susceptible to infection and illness, but the results proved nothing of the sort. As American scientific journalist Gina Colata describes in her book Influenza, Navy doctors collected the mucus from men who were desperately ill from the flu, gathering thick viscous secretions from their noses and throats. They sprayed mucus from flu patients into the noses and throats of some men and dropped it into other men's eyes. In one attempt, they swabbed mucus from the back of the nose of a man with the flu and then directly swabbed one patient's nasal septum and rubbed it directly onto the nasal septum of one of the volunteers, trying to simulate what happens naturally when people are exposed to flu victims. The doctors took 10 of the volunteers onto the hospital ward where men were dying of the disease. The sick men lay huddled on their narrow beds, burning with fever, drifting in and out of sleep in a delirium. The 10 healthy men were given their instructions. Each was to walk up to the bed of a sick man and draw near him, lean into his face, breathe in his fetid breath, and chat with him for 5 minutes, to be sure that the healthy man had had a full exposure to the sick man's disease. The sick man was to exhale deeply while the healthy man drew the sick man's breath directly into his own lungs. Finally, the flu victim coughed 5 times in the volunteer's face. Each healthy volunteer repeated these actions with 10 different flu patients. Each flu patient had been seriously ill for no more than 3 days, a period when the virus or whatever it was that was causing the flu should still be around in his mucus, in his nose, in his lungs, but not a single healthy man got sick. A comparable experiment, carried out under much stricter conditions, took place in San Francisco, with 50 imprisoned sailors, but, once again, the results did not correspond with what the doctors had expected. Published an article that was opened with a photo showing baseball players wearing protective masks during the 1918 so-called Spanish flu epidemic. While many mainstream media claimed that records from back then fatally remind of the corona crisis, in 2020, Süddeutsche Zeitung, Axios reported a bit more differentiated and wrote, in some respects, the coronavirus and Spanish flu aren't all that comparable. After all, the war provided a vastly different backdrop. Little was known about viruses at the time. Imagine having no idea what you were suffering from, and medicine was far less advanced. In 1918, the basic treatments that were offered were enemas, whiskey and bloodletting. Hospitals as we know them today were quite different. There were no intensive care doctors, and no antibiotics to treat any secondary infection. So it was a very different time and a very different way of practicing medicine, said Dr. Jeremy Brown, National Institutes of Health, per CBS. Source, screenshot from Axios.com. Scientists were stunned. If these healthy volunteers did not get infected with influenza despite doctors' best efforts to make them ill, then what was causing this disease? How exactly did people get the flu? Pandemic 1918. Overmedication and massive vaccination campaigns. A look at history books and statistics shows that epidemics always developed where human immune systems had been weakened, primarily because of lack of food and clean water.
This was also the case with the pandemic of 1918. A panoply of causes,
which naturally could also have worked in combination, comes into consideration. Psychological stress, evoked by fears of war, overtreatment with chemical preparations, which can seriously compromise the immune system, including painkillers like aspirin or chloroform. Chloroform, which was used as a preservative in medications,
and transformed into phosgene in the body liver, which was used as poison gas in the First World War.
In the late 19th century, manufacturers of medicinal products also increasingly began selling products that contained highly toxic substances like morphine, codeine, quinine and strychnine as medicines. At that time there were no regulations for such manufacturers. From 1898, the German inventor of aspirin, Bayer, sold heroin, for example, as an allegedly non-addictive morphine substitute, and also as a cough remedy in many different forms,
ranging from syrup, in noble-looking flacons to plugs, powders, liquids,
and tampons soaked in it for gynecological treatments. Damage to airway organs resulting from preventive measures, like rubbing the throat with antiseptic preparations or inhaling antibacterial substances. Many of the substances used at that time also contained silver and have long been prohibited. For example, formalin, formaldehyde has strong corrosive and irritating effects on skin, eyes,
and airway, and can cause kidney,
liver and lung damage. A carcinogenic potential is also attributed to it. No effective antibiotics. Many peoples were afflicted by bacterial and fungal infections. But the first really effective means of killing bacteria and fungi was penicillin,
which was discovered much later,
in 1928, and became a medication during the Second World War. Vaccines often contain toxic heavy metals and were produced out of poorly filtered mucus or other fluids from infected patients. November 1918. Preventive treatment against influenza with a throat spray. American Red Cross. Love Field, Texas. With permission of the National Museum of Health and Medicine, Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. Washington, D.C. Reeve. A frequently observed symptom of the Spanish flu was internal bleeding in the lungs, typical of tuberculosis patients. For example, a phenomenon that was also described as a result of smallpox vaccinations. In fact, numerous sources report that mass vaccinations, up to 24 vaccinations per person, decisively contributed to the pandemic. American author Eleanor Ra McBean relates her own experiences. All the doctors and people who were living at the time of the 1918 Spanish influenza epidemic say it was the most terrible disease the world has ever had. Strong men, hale and hearty, one day would be dead the next. The disease had the characteristics of the Black Death added to typhus, diphtheria,
pneumonia, smallpox,
paralysis, and all the diseases the people had been vaccinated with immediately following World War I.
Practically the entire population had been injected, seeded, with a dozen or more diseases, or toxic serums. When all those doctor-made diseases started breaking out all at once, it was tragic. That pandemic dragged on for 2 years.
Kept alive with the addition of more poison drugs administered by the doctors who tried to suppress the symptoms. As far as I could find out, the flu hit only the vaccinated. Those who had refused the shots escaped the flu.
My family had refused all the vaccinations, so we remained well all the time.
We knew from the health teachings of Graham, Trail, Tilden and others, that people cannot contaminate the body with poisons without causing disease, when the flu was at its peak. All the stores were closed as well as the schools, businesses, even the hospital, as the doctors and nurses had been vaccinated too and were down with the flu. No one was on the streets. It was like a ghost town. We seemed to be the only family that didn't get the flu, so my parents went from house to house doing what they could to look after the sick.
As it was impossible to get a doctor then.
If it were possible for germs, bacteria, virus, or bacilli to cause disease, they had plenty of opportunity to attack my parents when they were spending many hours a day in the sick rooms.
But they didn't get the flu and they didn't bring any germs home to attack us children and cause anything. None of our family had the flu, not even a sniffle, and it was in the winter with deep snow on the ground. On the 20th of March 2020, the US newspaper The Bemidji Pioneer published an article about the COVID-19 lockdown, picturing it with a 1918 cover story from its own publication. In the 2020 article it says, Gov. Tim Walz closed Minnesota's restaurants and bars to dine in and drink in customers this week.
A similar thing happened. A edition of the Bemidji Daily Pioneer blared this messy in all capital letters. Public places are ordered closed. Unfortunately,
the newspaper did not tell its readers that the parallel drawn here is completely wrong. Because back then,
the roughly 675,000 Americans who were said to have been victims of the so-called Spanish flu
did not die of a virus,
but of the turmoil of war,
i.e.,
malnutrition, psychostress,
treatment with chemical poisons or highly toxic vaccines. Why COVID-19 is not a viral disease, see Chapter 12. Source: BemidjiPioneer.com. When I see people cringe when someone near them sneezes or coughs.
I wonder how long it will take them to find out that they can't catch it, whatever it is. The only way they can get a disease is to develop it themselves by wrong eating, drinking, smoking, or doing some other things which cause internal poisoning and lowered vitality. All diseases are preventable and most of them are curable with the right methods, not known to medical doctors. And not all drugless doctors know them either. It has been said that the 1918 flu epidemic killed 20 million people throughout the world, but actually,
the doctors killed them with their crude and deadly treatments and drugs.
This is a harsh accusation, but it is nevertheless true, judging by the success of the drugless doctors in comparison with that of the medical doctors, while the medical men and medical hospitals were losing 33% of their flu cases. The non-medical hospitals such as Battle Creek, Kellogg and McFadden's Health Restorium were getting almost 100% healings with their water cure, baths, enemas, etc., fasting and certain other simple healing methods, followed by carefully worked out diets of natural foods. One health doctor didn't lose a patient in 8 years. If the medical doctors had been as advanced as the drugless doctors, there would not have been those 20 million deaths from the medical flu treatment. There was 7 times more disease among the vaccinated soldiers than among the unvaccinated civilians. And the diseases were those they had been vaccinated against.
One soldier who had returned from overseas in 1912 told me that the army hospitals were filled with cases of infantile paralysis polio. And he wondered why grown men should have an infant disease.
Now, we know that paralysis is a common after effect of vaccine poisoning. Those at home didn't get the paralysis until after the worldwide vaccination campaign in 1918. Spanish flu 1918, entrainment camp. Genicart, France, administration of vaccines against flu and lung infections. With permission of the National Museum of Health and Medicine, Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. Washington, D.C.
Rev. 15663 author Anne Riley Hale alludes to all of the above factors in her 1935 book Medical Voodoo, as everyone knows. The world has never witnessed such an orgy of vaccination and inoculation of every description as was inflicted by army camp doctors upon the soldiers of the First World War. Hale also observed that the amazing disease and death toll among them occurred among the picked men of the nation, supposedly the most robust,
resistant class of all, who presumably brought to the service each a good pair of lungs, since they must have passed a rigid physical examination by competent medical men. And yet, precisely these supermen with super lungs were the ones who were dropping like flies from pulmonary tuberculosis. In this context, a report in the Idaho Observer, July 2003, is also worth noting. It mentions a contemporary vaccination trial by one Dr. Rose Now, published in the Mayo Collected Papers of the world-renowned Mayo Clinic. According to this paper, the vaccinated guinea pigs primarily suffered severe damage in their lungs. A typical symptom of tuberculosis and other diseases of the Spanish flu. Doctors respond to the catastrophe with overwhelming silence. Meanwhile, medical historians are amazed that doctors and the media have remained silent about the catastrophes that resulted from Spanish flu. As Carlotta writes in her book, Victor Vaughan, at that time, America's top military doctor, dealt with the mega catastrophe in just one paragraph of his 464-page-long memoirs. And yet, Vaughan must have recollected everything very well, as his book appeared in 1926. Not long after the war's end, and he probably would never forget the horrific events. If anyone might be expected to write about the epidemic, it was Vaughan, writes Carlotta. Like Vaughan, other army doctors remained steadfastly silent. The pandemic, one of the worst to ever afflict the earth, was simply virtually erased from newspapers, magazines, books and society's collective memory, says Carlotta. This could be psychologically explained in 2 ways. The catastrophe presented a very personal catastrophe for physicians, because, although they were basically given all the money and material resources in their world to fight the alleged flu, they were unsuccessful in preventing the disaster. In a brutally clear way, doctors and pharmacologists were shown the limits of their power. It is clear that mainstream medicine prefers not to dwell on such a total defeat, let alone expand upon it in memoirs or newspapers. Perhaps the occasional scientist, doctor or politician began to mull over the lost campaign against an imaginary virus and entertained the thought that the mass administration of highly toxic vaccines and medications could have been at least partially responsible for the pandemic.
Clues for this were by all means visible, but who likes to take responsible for the deaths of millions of people, even unintentionally, and admit failure to fulfill the duty to investigate all factors that come into question? Spanish flu, interior view of influenza ward.
U.S. Army Field Hospital No. 29. Hollerich, Luxembourg, 1918. Look at the men's faces. They're covered to try and check the alleged airborne spread of the disease. With permission of the National Museum of Health and Medicine, Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. Washington.